We would crawl out to get some greenery, to get some food. And my mother and I used to dig out dandelions and different greenery that grew around our bomb shelter so we can eat. That was the only vegetable we had. And this became our existence. I remember dressing up in my burial clothes at the age of 13 years old. We had gotten word that day that we were going to be attacked, and we didn't know if we're going to last or not, if we're going to be able to survive. And I remember we had a ceasefire for 2 hours in the afternoon. And I remember putting on my Easter dress, my Sunday best, because I look pretty when they come to slaughter me, knowing that there would be no one to bury me. And I remember sobbing, begging my mother, I don't want to die. I'm only 13 years old. I don't want to die. And there was nothing my mother could say to me. We survived that night. But the only reason we survived that night is because that's the night when Israel came in physically into Lebanon and started helping the Christians. That's the night. That's the night where few people from my town went to Israel and begged for help, and Israel started coming, bringing ammunition to the Christians, came in physically into Lebanon and established the security zone, and started working with the Christians, training the Christians, and set up artillery bases around our town to protect us from the attacks of the Muslim invaders who wanted to slaughter us. And this is how we continued living until 1982, when Israel finally invaded Lebanon all the way into Beirut. Israel working with the Christians to help the Christian Lebanese take back their country, reinforce and reestablish their democracy, and sign a peace treaty with Israel. Because at that point, the rest of the world was not paying attention to what was happening in the country. Because as long as Jewish blood was being shed on the streets of Tel Aviv and Christian blood was being shed on the streets of Beirut, nobody in the world gave a darn. It wasn't until September 11th, 2001, when America was attacked, that the rest of the world woke up and realized, oh my gosh, why do they hate us? I could have told you that as a 10-year-old child. They hate us because we are infidels. Israel ended up kicking the majority of the Islamic terrorists out of the country with Yasser Arafat and his cronies all the way out to Tunisia. And we came out of the bomb shelter and back to rebuilding our lives. I ended up moving to Israel, becoming news anchor for World News, reporting on world events in Jerusalem, where I was exposed to world media that was not filtered through Arabic propaganda filters that Arabs are oblivious to. And I started connecting the dots as I reported on world events, on stories happening around the world. I was news anchor from 1984 till 1989. That's when we started seeing radical Islam on the rise and terrorist activities happening around the world. And as I reported night after night, I started realizing there was a pattern developing. Because no matter where the terrorist activity took place, the name of the perpetrators were always the same. Ahmed, Muhammad, Ali, Khalil, Hussein. The name of their victims were always Christians and Jews, Westerners. Terry Waite, Terry Anderson, Colonel Higgins, the Akili Lauro, the TWA, the Panam flights, and I can go on and on. As a matter of fact, I have 3-page list in my first book, Because They Hate, about all the attacks around the world that the world did not connect the dot. It's like the 9/11 Commission report that said, we lacked imagination. Well, my friends, 9.5 years after September 11th, we cannot hide behind that excuse and say we lacked imagination. And when I started reporting on world activities around the world and watching what's happening with the Islamic radical agenda, I started realizing that what I used to think was a regional problem in the Middle East, between a majority Muslim Middle East trying to kill or expel the minority Christians and Jews, had become a worldwide problem. But the world was not paying attention. The world came up with an excuse to whatever the situation, wherever the problem was happening. They were not connecting the dots. The same pattern was beginning to develop in Europe. By the time I was news anchor for World News, we started seeing the problems rising in Europe with the Islamic infiltration. The same thing as we lost Lebanon, now we are seeing in Europe. Europe is no longer Europe. Europe has become Eurabia. It started in Europe 30 years ago. And the way it started, again with the same pattern, they opened up for Islamic immigration. After World War II, Europe needed people to build Europe, to work in constructions. They had lost a lot of men. So they needed to bring labor force that the Europeans were not willing to do, even if they were able and there were people there. They were bringing these poor Muslims from Algeria and Tunisia and Kuwait and all these surrounding countries to supposedly come under the, here it comes, guest worker program. So they came into Europe and they started building Europe. And these cheap workers were supposed to be there working in constructions for 2 years and then make some money and then go back to their families. Well, they came and they worked again and they worked some more. And the Europeans realized, you know what, we are enjoying this extra money that we're making in our luxurious lifestyle, and we really do not want to work in constructions, and we do not mind these Muslims coming from all these countries. Let them come, let them stay, and because we are so good, we're going to gather together as the European Union and we're going to come up with the family reunification program, where we bring the families of these poor Muslim workers to live with them in Europe. So the Europeans passed the family reunification program and brought the families of these working men. They started growing in their own communities. They started having a lot of babies, living off the welfare system in Europe, which the Europeans, love to help them out. I mean, remember, we in the West are fair and tolerant and open-minded, and we want to help people out. I mean, we have the same thing happening here in our country. So the Islamic immigrants started abusing the welfare system. And the more they took over money from the governments, they started staying home, growing their families, marrying multiple wives, and having many children, and supporting their families by the welfare system. And once they became a major bloc, they started pushing for rights in Europe, for representation in the government. We are seeing what's happening in Europe today. In the UK alone, in Britain alone, they have over 100 Sharia Islamic courts operating parallel to British court. In France alone, there are 750 no-go zones where the police are afraid to enter those areas. The police are afraid to enter those areas. Street signs are in Arabic, where even if you are a taxi and you entered these neighborhoods, if you got lost, you wouldn't even know how to get back out. And the same thing is happening in areas in London and surrounding London as well. The same thing is happening in Belgium. We are starting to see resistance. The Swiss and the Dutch are now starting to resist because they are getting fed up with what's happening with Islamic immigration, because of the crime rate that is rising all over Europe as well. Because of the crime rate that is rising in Europe, especially rape and crimes against women. So even the Swiss, who would have thought that the Swiss this year, almost 60% voted to ban the minarets in Switzerland. Great progress. Geert Wilders' party in Holland, the Dutch, who tolerate anything. I mean, have you ever heard the Dutch being offended of anything? Even the Dutch, Geert Wilders' party, just won, which is the anti-Islam party, just won. It's now becoming the third party in Holland. Over 21% of the votes, they're won. Right now in Europe, whether in Belgium, in Denmark, all over Europe, they are now parties running with their platform is defeating the Islamic agenda in Europe. Their platform, something our elected officials in the United States wouldn't even dare and utter because they are too afraid. So we need to ask ourselves, what is making European cultures, the Swiss and the Dutch, what's making these people who would tolerate anything and everything become so resistant? Well, let's move right now to the United States.